You're listening to the Player Layer podcast. I'm your host, Ivan Alexiev, and today I'm very happy to have with me Eduardo Baraf. Edo is both, he wears a lot of hats. He is a game designer, he's a game publisher, he works in both digital games and tabletop games. He also reviews games, he previews games, he has a YouTube channel called Gaming with Edo. I'm sure there's even more stuff that he's involved with in the gaming industry. So we got to cover a lot of topics, and I'm very, very excited to kind of share this conversation with you because I think he has a very unique viewpoint and just a lot of great advice if you're interested in doing game design or anything that has to do with games. I think this would be a great conversation for you to listen to. So thank you very much again and enjoy. And first of all, how are you doing, Edo?
I'm doing all right. Heading into the Thanksgiving break here in the States, so things are pretty relaxed.
Awesome. Could you tell me how you first got into game design? I know you've been doing game design for a pretty long time.
Yeah, I've been pretty fortunate that I've been either doing games or sort of technology for my entire career. But basically, I played a ton of video games as a kid. Didn't really design anything, just board games and video games and that kind of thing. And then I went to the University of Michigan and I wanted to join, which is a huge school, and I wanted to join a group that was making games. And the only group that had anything to do with video games was the Dr. Mario Club, where they played and competed in Dr. Mario, which is interesting in and of itself. But because no one else was doing it, I started an organization on campus called Wolverine Soft. And that's where we started making stuff. We had some fits and some problems, but ultimately made a game called Crisis Wolverine Insurrection Green, which was like a campus-based role-playing game. And then from there, got into QA, and then from QA to production and design, and have been doing a lot of design in video games since. And then on the board game space, the first game I worked on was a game called Murder of Crows with Thomas Denmark. He had already started it, but he needed some support on the design side, and we started working together. He and I were working at a video game company together at the same time. And from there I did more and more. So I've been fortunate enough to be around the games basically my whole life.
Yeah. How does it compare, like, the video game industry and how did you make that shift to board games?
That's interesting. It's a pretty broad question. I think in a couple key ways. One, at the time I was working on a online Facebook games and mobile games, and we had shut down a game after 2 or 3 years. And, when you shut down a online game, it disappears, right? No one can play it. It's gone. And I was very interested at that time in making a board game, again, because they're permanent, right? Like, they might not be popular and they may not be selling, but they don't become obsolete. Like, you can just always have it on the shelf as long as it doesn't get set on fire. You can play it again. And so that was very appealing. I think a big difference. Another difference is typically team size. Board games are going to be smaller teams than video games, though indie games are pretty small. And there's some big board games. But the other thing I really like about board games is that they're WYSIWYG, like what you see is what you get, right? You don't need an engineer to make things happen, and you don't need all the tools and technology to make things happen. You can sort of really be pen and paper and then build it out. And, it's the magic you can make with a video game is fantastic, but there's just this mountain of complexities you have to deal with and resolve, and bugs and crashes and what tools and tech to use, and just, the whole gamut. And so a lot of that doesn't exist in board games. So it's not that it's more pure, but it's definitely a straighter line from an idea to an execution in board games. For the other side of it is, if you make a mobile game, you can sell 1 or a million copies or get 1 or a million downloads. and you don't have to print it in advance, right? So there's no cost of goods in video games, whereas in board games you have to. So, there are lots of different facets. I've definitely found that there's a lot of design overlap between both, and player experience overlap, and sort of how you would take on a project. So I think definitely somebody who's made board games is suited to start learning and moving into video games, or somebody who's made a video game or two or designed one could translate a lot of that towards board games. I mean, I think it's pretty close. I think the last thing I would say is I do find the board game community. I like the board game community a bit more. I feel like inherent to board games is this idea of playing together and communicating and cooperating, right? They're like this thing you're going to play with friends together, and it sort of, draws that kind of person. Whereas I think video games has a lot of that, but also has a lot of sort of solo experiences. And I found the indie board game scene to be more universally engaging, accepting, supportive. You do see that in indie video games, but just not. I feel like you also have a lot more people who are just sort of out for their own and making their own thing in one-upsmanship. And, they just have a little bit of a different vibe. Neither is bad or good, right? But like I found the board game space a bit more welcoming and a bit more supportive from my experiences.
Because you've been through this process many times, you've had a ton of Kickstarters and lots of games. How do you usually start out with a game? What do you look for when you have that first idea, maybe? And yeah, how does that process begin for you with a game?
From my perspective, I find that inspiration for games comes from all sorts of places. Sometimes you're inspired by a piece of art. Sometimes you're inspired by a game mechanic. Sometimes you're inspired by the idea of working with folks. And, each really is a different kickoff point for a game. Like, to give an example, take Liftoff, which is a game I designed. I was playing a lot of Ticket to Ride. I was playing Catan. I was playing Small World. I was playing a lot of those sort of classic Carcassonne type games. And that was at the time I really wanted to make a game because of what happened with that Facebook game I was talking about. And so I was sort of in the zone of like wanting to make and be this sort of 45-minute gateway, all ages or broad ages type of experience. And that's sort of where I started. And I just started with, the idea of having pretty simple resources and trying to create a sort of dynamic play around it. And the original Liftoff wasn't a planet. It was actually, you were trying to get off a desert island. And then that sort of felt lame to me at the time. And I was like, well, what if you're trying to get off a planet as opposed to like a little island? But in contrast, right, like with Herbaceous was all about this art that Beth Sobel had created for a different reason. She had reskinned Bonanza with this incredible herb art. Mm-hmm. And I remember seeing it. I mean, I literally saw the art on Facebook and saying like, somebody needs to make a game with this art, and it like should be really universally appealing. And I actually originally thought it'd be great to make it a solitaire game, and like literally like a game you play on Sunday with tea by yourself. And I reached out to her and she said sure. And originally she thought I was asking for more like art in that style, but I was like, no. I mean, I literally mean that art plus or minus 3 or 4 or 5 pieces. But actually, I struggled doing the solo solitaire game. I had bought a bunch of books actually on traditional solitaire, and like it isn't a type of game I play that much. And I wasn't trying to do a solo design. I was really trying to make much more of a solitaire game, right? Like a solo game versus take a game that's multiplayer and make it single player. And so I was struggling with it. And then at the time, I had known Steve Finn actually through some of the reviewer stuff because I'd reviewed a couple of his games and I think I met him at a con or whatever. I asked him if he had done any solo design, and he was like, no, but I've done multiplayer stuff. And I was like, well, we're not getting anywhere on solo. I'll give it a shot. And then he designed it. And I thought he did a fantastic job, and it really fit audience and type of game I wanted to make, but it wasn't solo. And then actually full circle, a little bit down the road, I was like telling this exact story at Gen Con to Keith Mateka, who I had just met. And Keith was like, I do solo designs. Yeah. Let me do it. and I was like, sure. And so he ended up, so Herbaceous does have a solo mode. And so that, and then, ultimately I've worked with Keith a lot more. I've worked with Steve a lot more. I've worked with Beth a lot more. So it was a great start. But the long and the short was, that was inspired by art. I mean, Skulk Hollow was just inspired by the idea of like small creatures taking on a gigantic monster in Shadow of the Colossus, right? Like that's like a very thematic start as opposed to mechanic one or something else. So, for 100 Tori, I'd known Scott Caputo for a while with the League of Game Makers, and Vincent Dutrait had expressed interest in working on a project. And so that one was a lot about the opportunity to work with Vincent and Scott, which I thought was fantastic. So, I think, ultimately, while I have designed a number of games, and at a high level, I often operate as a product lead or creative director or somebody who's sort of tying everything together. And I do a lot of the component and sort of product manufacturing work. But I'm not, I'm not a laned designer. So like, if I feel like I can do a good job, I'll do it. But if I feel like, no, this designer would be doing a better job than I would, I take on various roles on all the projects. I'm not, sort of exclusively in one seat. So it leaves a lot of openings to work in just different ways within games. And I enjoy that a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember the first time I tried Herbaceous, I could immediately tell that Steve Fenn was a part of the team because my first association was like Biblios when I played it. But it's a really good game, and it does have its own.
Oh yeah, no, for sure, it's got that Biblios vibe. And in fact, I mean, one of the more interesting things was Keith was a fan of Biblios, and Keith, in some ways, the solo mode is almost one step closer to Biblios than the 2 to 4 player mode because of the extra third placer putting a card. My relationship with Steve Finn started with me like basically grossly critiquing the theme of Biblios in my first videos really early in. I love the game. I was just like, I have no interest in Buddha. I don't think I'm Buddhist monks, but monks, European monks or whatever. I don't know what you want. But like the whole thematic space of it was very Euro and very like, I could care less. No offense to anyone who cares more about it. But like, to me, it was like, could this be any other theme than, monks and scribes? And so, that's actually how we first met, because that review because I was sort of ridiculing it, I guess. It got a lot of social media attention, not that much, more than like a normal one would. And he saw it, and it was a very positive review. I think the game is a fantastic game. But then he was like, hey, I'm doing a Kickstarter with Biblios Dice. Do you want to do a preview for it? And that's sort of how we got more in touch.
Yeah. Could you tell me about the co-designing process? Like you said that you're more of, you can take different roles, but when you're designing with other designers, how do you sort of organize the whole thing, and how do you decide what stays in the game ultimately?
Sure. And it's really different with not, this isn't, I don't think, true across the industry, but certainly for my stuff. For the most part, pencil first games are not solicited designs, which is to say, a designer has already fully designed a game top to bottom, and I'm just licensing it as a publisher and going from there. Most of pencil first game stuff starts with the idea of what we want the game to be, the type of game, the space, and sort of driving into it from that perspective. So like an example would be for Sunset Over Water, it was really fun starting with Beth's art for Herbaceous. We should do that again. Hey, Beth, what are like some things you want to draw? And she's like, well, I don't really get a chance to. draw landscape. And she listed a few things, and we said, well, we could do landscapes. And so the premise to Steve was like, well, hey, you're going to have a game with a lot of landscape paintings, right? And like, what would that mean? And so, you know, he started taking that on. And so usually there's like, for these projects, often there's like essentially a premise or like if you think of, I've spoken a lot about mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. Oftentimes when I'm working with a designer, I'll talk to the aesthetics and the dynamics. It's like, I want these types of moments, this type of experience. It should feel like this. And then the designer will be like, all right, well, let me mess around for a while. And so the process is usually the designer will work on that, then bring it back. And I've, over the, you know, it's taken times, but I think people are fantastic at what they do. And I go out of my way not to, mandate or prescribe what their things are. I like much more to like align on what the vision or goal for the product is, and then go from there. So a lot of times the designer is really doing a ton of the work. I'll be there at the beginning, and then as it's coming together and I'm reviewing first versions and stuff, that's where, you know, it's a little bit more like a supercharged developer in that, you know, ultimately I have a little bit more sway than just like a developer in another organization. But a lot of it's like, well, I played it and this sort of sucked and that's confusing and this doesn't feel like it's reinforcing this idea. Or, for the Whatnot cabinet, which is releasing early next year, Steve and I were working on it, and we knew, again, started with collecting, what do we want? We want to be collecting small, little, beautiful objects that Beth Sobel will draw. But then thinking about the experience, and sometimes it's like, one of the things that Steve likes using all the time are initiative cards. Like he loves that in his designs. So you'll have a lot of cards that will have like, it'll have an action, but it'll also have like a number like 37, and like 37 goes before 27 or goes after 27 or whatever. And like, it'll be used for turn order. And an example of that went into Sunset Over Water, where he had just numbers at the bottom of the card. And, a place where I did some development was like, sort of like, man, just looking at a number sucks. Like, could it be like the time you wake up in the morning? And so we, because suddenly it's thematic. Suddenly it's like, oh, whoever woke up first goes first. That feels much better than whoever had the 22 went but goes. But anyway, so for the Whatnot cabinet, the first version had that sort of initiative card thing. And in that case, it was just like, hey man, I don't want to do another one of these. Like, we did that with Sunset. Like, let's not, what other ways can we have initiative? And I was like, well, there's like the King Domino way. There's what the guys, Bruno Cathala. Yeah. Had Bruno Cathala. Like, he always does the sort of, leave your pawn initiative track, sometimes with betting or not, depends on the game, but he's pretty fond of that kind of initiative where like you pick something and that's going to establish turn order by looking at where the pawns are in a line, right? Mm-hmm. And I sort of pitched that to him. I was like, hey, that's very similar to what you do, but it's like not the same and it's a little different. And like, you could be selecting the actions. And so, he did some versions of that and it worked. I didn't design any of that implementation. It was sort of like, hey, maybe we go this way, we go that. I usually am heavily involved in the rules and then building things out. So another place, like when you're making the components and bringing the game to the table, you start hitting things like, oh man, it sucks to be doing this, or, I don't want, it's a small game. I don't want 300 of these things. Can we like think of it another way? So, it's that kind of a dialogue. Yeah, like if I think about Skulk Hollow, which initially was inspired by an idea my kid had, which was crazy because he wanted to make a 15-person game, which was one player versus 14 other players. And I was like, what if the other 14 players was just controlled by one person? But that was like, I had actually like, I knew I wanted a board. I knew I wanted it a diamond like confrontations. I knew I wanted the monster, and you jump from the board to the monster and you had action cards. And I knew I didn't want dice. and I knew I didn't want measurement, right? Like that was like, this should be easy to pick up, thematic, jumping on, taking out abilities. So like that was like really clear to me, but I was struggling to like make a game or make it fun, right? Like I knew there was something in there, but like I was just not getting it. And that's when, whatever I was talking to Keith about, Keith got involved. And from there, he took it all. Like he really built out the cards and how they work. But like if you go pull up my original prototype, which was an idea of a game, but not actually a fun game. Mm-hmm. It's all the same components. It's all the same elements, but he actually made it a game. And then really my role with that is just play testing a ton and giving him feedback on the game and the experience. And then really trying to execute the product vision with the Guardians and working with Dustin. So, it's very different. It's much more like video games for what it's worth. Like the model and board games of like a designer does a prototype independent from the group, pitches it, somebody buys the design and then essentially develops it and skins it, sometimes with the designer or sometimes completely without the designer, is totally foreign to me from my experience coming through video games first. And video games, super indie, you're like finding friends to work with, but just generally speaking, you're working at a team in a company and people are specialists in their roles, and the engineers and the artists and the designers are all good at what they do. And the producer or product lead is there to like make sure everyone's working together, and you allow people to shine in their own respects, but it's just not as like, it's much more collaborative and everyone in all disciplines working together from start to finish. Whereas again, I really think the Kickstarter change has changed all this. But if you go back 10 years to the sort of gatekeeper publisher route, it was much more not assembly line. I think that's too much of a pejorative. But like again, this handoff process, which is just very different.
Yeah, I find a lot of times that like restrictions or somebody giving you something to work with as a designer, it's sometimes easier, and sometimes it leads to some like really creative ideas when you can bounce ideas off of each other. Could you tell me about, because you mentioned playtesting Skulk Hollow, could you tell me what are some ways that designers can like optimize their playtesting process and how you go about it?
Sure. I mean, I think playtesting largely depends on the game. And obviously we're now in a very different period with the COVID situation. So like, generally speaking, 2 years ago, a year ago, it was about knowing who your playtest group was, and making sure that when you did come to playtest, you were prepared, you had an agenda, you knew how you were going to do it, and a lot of different sort of methodologies that taking on a playtest. Actually, it is something I have a video about, which is like running a playtest. But now it's very different. Like now, what is sort of key to the development that everyone's doing is whether it's Tabletopia or Tabletop Simulator, both are pretty easy to get started with. Tabletopia arguably is a little bit easier, but it depends on what you're comfortable with. Having your prototype playable online is critical. I mean, it's a requirement. And then now there are all these new Discord and other community groups are focused around playtesting and doing those digital playtestings. It's not exactly the same, but it is bridging the gap between what you're able to do and what was possible previously. So, for example, Mall Peak, which is in heavy playtesting right now, which is the sequel to Skulk Hollow, we have a Tabletopia version that we regularly are testing and playing. The other titles, I mean, when Foliferous, which is coming to Kickstarter in probably February or March, depending, I'm working with Steve Finn, and that was a game where that was actually an interesting one. It was an interesting one because I've really wanted to make a menagerie game with legendary creatures that's lighter weight. And so the brief, so to speak, to Steve was like, I want a game with a ton of meeples, where you have to collect meeples of all different shapes and sizes. And he started in on it, and he was working on it, and boy, he was just whiffing over, and like nothing was coming together. And then we got to one which was like good, but not like, it basically came down to like, why don't you just remove all of this stuff and let's do a simple game like this? And it was sort of like, I don't remember the exact conversation. He's like, yeah, but that doesn't hit any of the things that you were looking for in this title. And it was sort of like, yeah, but we're not coming anywhere close to that anyway. So like, let's just forget that ask and go and just make this game, because this set of mechanics is a lot of fun. You're just trying too hard to do all these other things. And if we simplify it, we can go, we can, instead of making it part of Legendary Creatures, we can go back and do it as part of sort of the standard line that we've been doing together, which is like the Herbaceous Sunset of Water, Herbaceous Sprouts, the Whatnot Cabinet. And so we took that on, and then we worked at that. So that was one where is just an example of massaging, getting something that had too much in it, and starting to cut things out from a design perspective. But the point is, the first time he pitched it to me was on Tabletopia. We played it on Tabletopia. He was live editing, and we were changing it while playing it on Tabletopia. And then, that's how we got through that process. So the other thing you can do, if you do know some groups and some people you're fans of, is Game Crafter is still working as of now. So you can sort of ship and get playables to folks to play. And really, you just need to have a good relationship with them to know that they're giving you good information and how to sort of decipher the testing. I did a pretty robust online play test with the print and plays for Heroes and Tricks. I think it had like 80 or 100 participants. I don't remember. But that was like a really robust process where we had signups and Reddit threads. And that was another one I did a video on. So you can still do the printed play route, but really the emergence of they've always been there, but the use of the Tabletopias and the tabletop simulators has really created this online playtesting network that's pretty effective right now.
Yeah, for sure. As a designer, what do you look for in the playtest itself? Like, do you usually go in with specific goals, or?
Yeah, I think to some extent it depends on the state of the game, where you are, but generally speaking, I will go into a playtest. And, ideally I'm observing it. It can be recorded. Either I'm teaching, if it's early, I'm teaching the game. If it's late, I have a rule book and I'm doing a blind test, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a really easy thing to track, right? Like, give them the rule book and then just see how, like, you can ask them to verbalize their confusion or dive in and playing, but like, basically, what was their experience dealing with the rule book? And then, did they play the game correctly? That's pretty cut and dry. Mm-hmm. Oh, they didn't follow that rule right. I probably should rewrite that rule. That's if you're like at that stage. Earlier though, for me, for playtesting, I'm just watching the experience. I have my own set of expectations on how it should roll and play, what should be easy, what should be complicated. And it's about seeing when people stall out, when people are successful. I do like to hear feedback at the end as well, but I look at a lot of it in watching and thinking about the experience that is unfolding. I like to get a variety of folks and backgrounds depending on the title. I did recently do a video about tracking time. I think it's very important to understand not just how long did the entirety of the experience take, how long did the rules take, how long does each turn take, and really sort of clocking out and seeing what parts of your game are fast, what parts of your game are slow. But for me, I've done it enough where you're really just, I'm less about the surveys, I guess. Like, the surveys afterwards, I think are valuable. But I've found that typically they're not as good as seeing what happened, and they're not as good as, like, a bunch of text isn't all that helpful. A bunch of ratings isn't all that helpful. if anything, the surveys that are most valuable are the ones that are tracking, like, how many tokens did you end with? What was your final score? How many turns did it take? Really sort of actionable data. I don't mind reading through 30 comments, but even then, you're just trying to look for commonalities or typical frustrations and that kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting to me because I've been doing a lot of playtesting with playtesting other people's games, and I find that usually what the best outcomes are is just for the designer having that video of the playtest without help from him, and how usually that's when you get those roadblocks, or you see what
for sure
what can go wrong. You mentioned kind of having hardships in a game where you can't figure out you can't find the fun, essentially. What can keep you motivated, or when do you know when to actually stop?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that's something you get a sense for over time, and you get a sort of a tolerance for it. In some ways, you learn the lesson of walking away from a design earlier by paying the price of releasing a game that wasn't fully, baked, or working on the design 6 months longer than you should have, and sort of until you've actually paid those costs, it's hard to really appreciate the importance. I don't know. I just think it takes a lot of trust and understanding from you and your teammates on what you're trying to do, and you're always going to look at investments and sunk costs and things like that. And there were, a good example of that to a degree. It's a little different, but it's relevant. Was Legendary Creatures. I was very clear in my mind that I wanted Legendary Creatures to be a 30 to 45-minute game. I started working with a designer I really enjoyed, and a person I really enjoyed, Christopher Ham, and working through the design on and on, it became very clear that, his sensibility and the level of complexity he was hitting was more than 45 minutes, right? We were looking at a game that was turning into a mid-weight game as opposed to like a light casual game or like a family. And I came to a point where I sort of had to make a decision where it was like, one, I either just walk away and go in a totally different direction because like we're not getting to where we need to be on that sort of original brief, or B, I say, you know what, I like this game, it's a ton of fun, Chris is doing a great job, which is all true. I just give up on the idea that it's going to be a 45-minute game and just roll into the 2-hour game. Ultimately, I did the latter. I think probably what would have had to happen when we made that decision was that we were going to refine the art a little bit and the marketing and make it like, my brand isn't really midweight game. Like, I don't have a brand for 2-hour games at Pencil First Games, so it's a little off our market, and that was a little bit of a struggle. But basically, the point was, in that moment, it was very clear that we were not on track to sort of what we were trying to do initially. And that was like a moment where you could have either throw, like, essentially we had to throw something out. And what I had to throw, I could have either thrown out the game or I had to throw out the idea. And I liked the game that Chris had made. It just wasn't the idea. So I had to chuck the idea. Whereas the opposite might be, in that Steve Finn example, throwing out like, this game sucks, there's some cool things in here, let's chuck these and go back and get the other one, and refine it. You just have to, I think a good way to understand that moment is like the fun, like, I really am a big fan of mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics, right? And I think you need to be able to envision the game being played by the people you need to think of the product. Who's going to play it? What type of fun are they going to have? Like, what's their experience going to be? And if what you have in front of you doesn't deliver that, you need to be able to draw the line to it. You need to be able to say, well, if we fix this, this, and this, we could get there. Or if this happened or this. But if you're like, man, we've been circling around this, a good, it isn't it can sometimes be a false positive, but if you've been doing work and you hit the second time, you're like, you've gotten back to where you were. Like you can, like, you work on some mechanics, whatever, and like you make some changes, and then like ultimately, like you basically have the same problem you had before you did the last month of work. Mm-hmm. That can happen once and you can pivot out of it. But then if you try again and you're back at the starting point again, that's usually a pretty good sign. Like something's going to change. Like either different people, different idea, different theme, different mechanics. But like if you find yourself, quote unquote, swirling, at Disney, we used to call it swirl. Like if you found a project in swirl, it just meant you were chasing your tail. And if you didn't make a dynamic change or dramatic change or reorg or whatever, you were just going to continue to swirl. Because like oddly enough, swirling has inertia that has to be dealt with. So yeah, it's a hard call. It's a project. It's like very specific to the endeavors, but it is important to ask yourself at different inflection points: are we on the right path? Are we doing the right thing?
Yeah, for sure. And there's several ways to look at it, I find. And I actually talked to Bruno Cathala a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things he said was just having a lot of projects in different stages, and like taking your mind off the project can, the way I understood it, can like make you less sentimental about it. And sometimes that's a good thing, because when you go back to it, you can kind of look at it with a fresh
yeah, I for sure. I think a different way of doing that as well is like just trying not to burden a design with the future of your business or your company or yourself, right? Like, which is especially the case on your first design, because as far as you know, it's your only design, right? But I think, the moment you put something on a timeline, you're on one hand, you're maybe shuttling it forward, but you're also not necessarily giving it space to breathe. So like being able to work on a variety of things, like an example is, in some ways, I mean, this is just more about not having a timeline, but like when we're working on Mall Peak, Foliferous, the expansion to the 100 Torii, I actually don't know which is going to finish first, right? Like I used to be more like, no, the order is this one, this one, this one. And then I'd get really frustrated and try to push things. But now much more, I'm like, no, we're working on all these things. One of them will hit a bump. One of them will take longer than expected, whatever. And one of them will go faster. And like, as they manifest, that's when they start coming together. So Floriferous manifested very quickly. Once we broke out of the problem we were having, this game moved quickly. The art came together very quickly. And so it's next. Whereas now, Tori and Malpeak are sort of competing for which would be next, and we'll see. They're not competing, but like, I just don't know the answer yet. And, and that's fine. So that comes with doing more games and having more success. But at the same time, it just, I think if you're trying to force something, sometimes it's better to just, as Bruno was saying, leave it alone, go work on something else and go back to it. That can be hard if you're like working with a team of people, right? That's very designery, who's just working on paper, right? As opposed to like a team of people who are being paid to do something. And, in video games, you get that problem a lot where it's like, it'd be great to like stop working on this and go working on something else, but the company is paying the salary of this 30-person team. And like, that's a luxury of like restarting, like that kind of sunken cost often forces a lot of decisions. It's always very different when you're working independently or not like getting paid. Because Bruno, I don't know, I don't want to speak for him, but like if you're an independent designer, you're working on stuff and like when it's ready, you sell it. You're not getting paid hourly to be doing it or salary to do it. Yeah, that may not be true for him. But it's very different than when you're like, no, this is all a team of people that are being paid month over month. And in 4, 8, 20, whatever amount of months, we're going to run out of money. Like it's a very different dynamic than working on something until you're happy enough to pitch it to a publisher.
Yeah, for sure. Especially when you have deadlines and you need to like fulfill it, and like the scenario you described, it is definitely different than getting your game ready and then presenting a finished product without having that deadline. So another broad question is, could you tell me what sort of the difference in mindset is between, you know, the publisher mind and the design mind when going into a game?
It's a good question. One thing I would say, just in general, is I don't really think of myself as a publisher, or and again, this is maybe where I'm a little more unique. Not unique, but you know, I'm sort of like an indie boutique publisher, not like a publisher, but like I think of myself as a game maker. Like I don't actually think of myself as a designer. I don't actually think of myself as a publisher. Like in my inner soul, I just think of myself as a game maker. And to me, that involves, you know, working through the ideation, the game design, the manufacturing, the publishment, you know, like all the things that bring a game to life. And so, you know, it's I've said it now like 5 times, but part of the idea around mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics is thinking about your game. So I think oftentimes designers don't think, they think about the game they want to make, they think about themselves, they think about how it's playing, the mechanics, right? But they aren't necessarily thinking about their audience, their users, their players. And to me, that's what makes it a product, and on the publishing side, right? Like it's about thinking about your game. It's about thinking about the design, the mechanics of the game. It's about thinking about the players, and then once you put past the product of publishing, you're thinking about the market. You're thinking about the rest of the games in the space. You're thinking about the price point. You're thinking about, you know, how's it going to be successful? What's it's going to be? How's it going to be different from the pack? You know, what's unique about it? Like, and so I find having a holistic understanding of the entire picture to be really valuable, rather than sort of having a broken up understanding. The part about thinking about what the player experiences really is a huge part of, you know, just, are you making the game for yourself, or are you making it for other people? And I think some designers innately know that. Other designers really just make games they enjoy. Like they play games, they make games, and they pass it over. But I do think it's really important to think about it that way. And so it's just like, I try not to bring a designer publisher framework per se. I try to bring the holistic view of the product from the get-go. Certainly, you could argue on the design side, you focus on what's the fun, what's the experience. And then on the publisher side, you're focused on, you know, how's it going to make money? What's the marketing? But even, you know, again, working in video games, I work in free-to-play mobile games, right? And so, like, it's easy to think of those things as different, but in fact, you know, how your design works and what monetization you use and how you sell your game is sort of intrinsic to the gameplay experience and the user experience. So you really do need to think about that sort of whole picture, if you want, you know, a game that is both fun but also, you know, pressures and incentivize people to spend money as they play, because it's, you know, they're getting it for free. You know, I think the more holistic that design is, the better. So I think that, you know, I would suggest to everyone that they think about it as design, product, market, not just, this is my job, somebody else is going to do the other jobs. Even if you're going to have other people do the other jobs, I think it's still valuable.
Mm-hmm. I love what you said about being a game maker, and because, you know, you can split that into 15 different, like they say, hats, you know. But ultimately, it is a whole process. And the other thing you said about sort of selfishly doing a game versus knowing your audience, I think is super valid for like many designers I know. It usually works in favor of the game when you're thinking about the audience. I find
For sure. I think so. Yeah, yeah.
if we can go back to mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics for a final time, I actually just today I rewatched your video of on that subject, and because we've already mentioned it a few times, and I'm not sure if we've like elaborated enough, could you kind of explain what the difference is between thinking mechanics and theme versus mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics? And I remember you gave an
Sure.
example of Lord of the Rings by Knizia.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. I'll let me be general, and then I'll get to some examples quickly. So, okay, so mechanics and themes is often how people break it up, and they're just thinking like, what's it sort of bleeds into like, how does the game work? What does it look like? I think there's more nuances to that, but it's sort of it's a pretty simple way of splitting an experience. Mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics is the idea that the game maker, the designer, creates mechanics. So on the left side, where the M is you have the designer making the mechanics, which are the rules, the foundation of the experience. And then dynamics are in the middle, where all those mechanics mix together. And then on the other side is the aesthetic, which you can think of the type of fun, the experience that the player is having, so the user is having. Is it a challenging game? Is it competitive, cooperative, fun? Is it a sense of exploration, journey, creative expression, submission, the idea that you're just like a pastime? And so, like the dynamics are the moments where of spark which come out of the underlying mechanics. So like, baseball's a pretty easy example, but you have like rules that are like, you have a batter, you have a pitcher, you can get out at each base. The dynamics would be the moment when there's a guy at first, on second, and third, each get one, first place gets 1 point or gets 2 points, second place gets 1 point when you're splitting up this territory, versus first place gets 10 points, second place gets 2 points, right? Suddenly, the difference between winning or losing that territory is much more dramatic, creating more of an outcome, right? And so those are what are producing those moments that are leading to the type of fun you're trying to create. And so it's really this idea of what you can control from the design side, and then how it translates through to the player experience, and being able to like think through and create those lines. I mentioned for me, the confrontation example is so powerful because in some ways, in that example, theme is sort of part of the resulting aesthetic. It's the fun of experiencing this world and these characters. And what happens in that game, if you're not familiar with it, listening, it's like Stratego. You have units facing you, the good guys versus the bad, and each unit all have like basic movement. You're on this. It's like a Stratego board, but it's a diamond. So you're working your way across. Good guys are trying to get the ring to the end, and the bad guys are just trying to kill everybody or kill Frodo or get to the Shire or kill Frodo or whatever, or essentially get the ring. And the dynamic of it is each character has a hidden ability, but the ability is create dynamics that drive the theme. So like the idea that if Frodo and Sam are in the same square, Sam and they get attacked, Sam can automatically defend, instead of like the opponent getting to pick. Or, I haven't played in a little bit, but like an example, I think Boromir is like a bomb. So like if he goes in front, he basically can sacrifice himself and kill anybody. And things like that, where you're playing with just these little standees and you're getting the experience. Not just that you're like, oh, the text says this, which reminds me of the book or the movie. It's more like, I just created this dynamic where I feel like how that character must have felt to make this decision, or what it must have been to try to capture Frodo. And every time you go to capture him, he gets away because his ability lets him retreat automatically. So you have to try to surround him. So those are really good examples of how pulling together those dynamics creates this type of fun, which is this sort of escapism, narrative fun along with competitive. So it's just a really good and interesting way, and I think it forces you as a designer to think of two important things. One, what the end goal experience, what the end goal player behavior, what the end goal fun you're trying for is, and how to build on that. But also in the middle, the idea that mechanics themselves are sort of just rules and aren't really what the player is they're doing the mechanics, but that's not typically where the fun, the moments, the enjoyment, the excitement come from. Those are typically the dynamics, which is like how the mechanics lay together. Another simple example from Herbaceous, which we were talking about. If you're not familiar with Herbaceous, you're gonna draw a card, you look at it, you decide if you want to keep it or not, or give it to everybody, like put it in a community pool. And based on what you decide on the first card, keep or give, you then flip over the next card, which you haven't seen, and it's the opposite. So essentially what that does is it means when I look at my first card, I have to decide how bad do I want this, or do I want to see the card I don't know yet? A totally different rule would have been draw two cards, put one in front of you and one in the middle, right? Mm. And now suddenly you no longer have that moment. You're just deciding what you want and what you want to give, as opposed to, do I keep this? Do I give this? And then also finding the reveal. Oh, I got the thing I didn't want. Or, oh, that was a great choice. And so they're really little ways to bring out those moments for players. So, I mean, that's sort of there again, I'll just, maybe if you can link it or otherwise, but so I've done a couple videos, but there's actually a paper by Marco Blanc and a number of other folks, which is like a written, very exclusive version of this. And then I can't remember the thing, but like a cartoon internet group, I forget what the name it is, but they did an amazing version of this where they explain it, all of which are better than mine. I had the luxury of working with Marco Blanc, worked at Looking Glass, on System Shock, and a bunch of other games. I then worked with him at Mind Control Software and a number of titles. And then ultimately Heroes Welcome was us working together one more time, where he had designed this game and we built it and published it. So, and that was an interesting one, in that Heroes Welcome is the only game, Pencil First Game is published that isn't really a Pencil First Games game. He was very, he had the design, he worked at my development there. I was really focused on the art, the execution, the product, the mechanics. I gave Mark feedback here and there. But, even with the rule book, he wanted to do it a certain way and he wanted this. And because of, this was very much, he had already made the game, knew it. And I was helping him bring his vision to life. Ultimately, after we did the Kickstarter and all that stuff, it was he didn't want to go down the route of being a publisher. He really just wanted to make Heroes Welcome. And so it made sense for Pencil First Games to sort of be the publisher in that sense. But, that was a project where, most of my feedback was a little bit more like a developer in the context of, well, it depends on the company, I guess. But I was not saying, hey, we need to change it. It was more like, hey, we saw this in the thing, what do you think? But very happy with how that game came out. And that Heroes Welcome is an amazingly thematic game where it is giving you this very unique experience of playing as the goblins who are both trying to fleece the heroes by, getting all their goods, getting them drunk, having them fall, basically getting all their money so they're broke and then they have to go back to the dungeon. And then at the same time, using those materials to sell to the bad guys who are going in the dungeon to fight them. So you're playing both sides of the market. And, it's a really interesting experience of how that's built out, and sort of it's like the sidecar to the standard adventure story. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. I want to get into. I want to ask you, because you're doing a lot of reviews, and obviously you're playing a lot of games. How important do you think it is for designers to play games, which they're not working on?
I mean, I think it's. I mean, older expression would be like, you can't write a book if you don't read. I, I don't know how accurate that is, but for sure, understanding and playing games is wildly valuable, both in terms of just looking at and understanding the marketplace and what the players are experiencing. Like, I can't tell you how many times somebody not pitches a game, but like talks about a game, mentions a game as a design. And I'm like, hey, you probably should play these 3 games because as far as I can tell, you're making them. And, or being aware of the marketplace, new mechanics, new combinations. I mean, I'm sure you can be a great chef with an incredible palate making a type of food without going off and eating a bunch of different cuisines from different countries and different, spices and stuff. But I suspect if you had the opportunity to go taste more, you'd improve your palate and your understanding of flavors and options and techniques. And then you can roll that back into the games you're making. So I think it's just valuable. It does take time, but being a reviewer has really forced me to play just so many games. And, I think it's really helped me.
Could you tell me, of course, as if there is no COVID, how your experience with conventions is, and what advice you would kind of give to somebody who's thinking of whether they should go to a convention or bring their board game to such an event or communities?
It's certainly a challenge right now. So the advice right now is to avoid. But I think it's hugely valuable. It's an opportunity to see your game with different people. I had a great Q&A with Eric Solawson, who designed Tattoo Stories, and we're working on a project together. And he has he designed a couple other games that have Monstrosity, or however that game is pronounced. But Eric, he broke into the industry and really grew through getting himself to conventions. I mean, it's like having that opportunity to engage and see the community and talk to more folks, show your game, play your game, get outside of your bubble, which right now is a bad thing. Stay in your bubble right now. But, I think it's hugely valuable. And the reality is there's conventions everywhere now, right? Like you can start going to conventions without trying to get to Gen Con. And I think people should be doing it.
Yeah, for sure. Sort of before we finish up, I always ask designers just for general advice to somebody who's thinking about making a game, thinking about doing a Kickstarter maybe. And I know that this whole conversation has been basically that, more or less. But what do you think are the most important things that someone should know who wants to start out in this?
For the long form version of this, I highly recommend some of my early videos. One's called So You Want to Make a Game, and the next one's called So You Want to Do a Kickstarter. I think those are both pretty informative. A lot of it comes down to sort of what you're thinking about, what you want and what you're trying to accomplish. Kickstarter serves a good, very specific purpose, but brings on a whole lot of additional work and effort around, if you just design something, you have to become a marketer and a manufacturer and a salesman and a whole bunch of other stuff, which you may or may not be comfortable with. So I think, if you're considering it, certainly seeping yourself in Kickstarter, seeing what's out there, joining the community groups, watching some videos, looking at the James Matthews stuff, look at the Stonemaier Games, Jamie Stegmaier stuff, is all super valuable. Certainly my videos can be helpful. And there are many others. But, I don't think you want to plan it, you want to think about it, you want to get your numbers right. But I don't think there's harm in trying. I think you just need to sort of make sure to walk through the end-to-end experience to know what you're getting into.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Oh, for sure. It's great. We really covered a lot of topics here.